Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today, Masechtas Menachot daf Ayin Tes. We are going to begin on Ayin Ches Amud Beis, toward the bottom by the Mishnah. We've been referring to the carbon Toda, which of course also is accompanying, has 40 breads, 30 of them which are matzah, 10 which is chametz. So the Mishnah says, Shachta chutz l'zmana. Let's say you shechted the carbon Toda with intention that it should be consumed, a kazayas, outside of the right time, which of course is considered to be pigul, or of a chutzlim kaima, or outside of the proper place, namely outside the azara. So we say it doesn't matter, kiddush alechem, it will still sanctify the bread, and therefore that's the din. Even though we said in the previous Mishnah that it has to be, for example, the bread has to be bifnim, within the walls, and it was a machlokes what that meant. The bread had to have a certain texture, had to already been cooked to the extent that it has crumbs, toasted. But when it comes to chutz l'zman and chutzim kaima, even though obviously that's a big no-no for a carbon, nonetheless the bread is still sanctified. Shachtim nimsa treifa. Let's say you shechted, and it turns out that the animal that you shechted was a treifa. So lo kiddush alechem. In that situation, the breads do not become sanctified. Shachtim nimsas baal mum. Let's say you shechted, and it turns out to be a baal mum. So in this situation, we have a machlokes. So Belezer omer kiddush, v'chachamim omer lo kiddush, which is part of question 1. It gives all these examples, and it says, Be'ezim min apsulim halo nechlu Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua im kiddush halechem. So certainly one is by nimsas bal mum. Okay, that's one. Shachtel shloshma. Let's say you shecht it, let's say for a totally different carbon, v'chein el hamiluyim. So too, when it came to the rams that were brought in the times of the miluyim, v'chein shnei kisyat seres, which were on Shavuos, sheshachtan shaloshman, lo kiddush halechem. Because we know on Shavuos, together with the shnei kisyat seres, we do tenufa together with the shtei halechem of wheat, and there has to be that it was lishma. So masnisa money, Rameir, desanya zehaklal. This is the general rule. Kol shipisuloi, if it became pasul koidim shchita, then lo kiddush halechem. For example, in the situation where it was already a treifa, so therefore the bread's not sanctified. Pisulo achar shchita kiddush halechem. In other words, the carbon was fine, but it was chutz l'zman, chutz l'kaimo, so the bread is sanctified. Shachta chutz l'zman, chutz l'kaimo kiddush halechem. As we said, because at the time that you brought it in, there was nothing wrong with the carbon. You later on caused problems. Shachta v'nimsas treifa lo kiddush halechem, because it was always a problem. It was nimsas treifa, but it was a treifa. Okay, from before. Ayin testament off. Shachta v'nimsas baal mum. So there, as we saw in the Mishnah, is a machlokes. Rabbi Eliezer omer kiddush, Rabbi Yeshua omer lo kiddush. Divrei Rabbi Meir omer Rabbi Yehuda nechlu Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua al sheshachta v'nimsas treifa. According to this Mandi Omer says no, it's not true. When it comes to the case of it turns out to be a shech and you becomes a treifa, again, everyone holds it's not kiddush, or which seems to be everyone holds that. Al chutz l'zman no shekiddush, al bal mum shelo kiddush, al mal nechel chutzim kaimoi. Interestingly enough, this is the second opinion, that there's a machlokes, not just by the case of nimsas bal mum, but in this case, it's in the event that you took the carbon toida and you shechted it chutzlun kaimo with a machshava that's going to go outside the right place. Okay, so place no kares. Rabbi Eliezer omer kiddush, Rabbi Yeshua omer lo kiddush. Okay, so then that's question 1. Those are the two answers of where it's a machlokes. Either, as we saw in the Mishnah itself, of nimsas balos mum or chutzim kaimo. Now chutzim kaimo is a little bit hard to understand, but that's what it says. Okay, so Omer Rabbi Eliezer, Hoyo v'chutz l'zmano pasul, v'chutz l'mkoimo pasul. We know that both of them pasul, right? That if you have the machshav that I'm going to eat it outside the right time, right place, they're the same. So machutz l'zmano kiddush, v'chutz l'mkoimo kiddush. It should be mekadosh in both cases, as the Mishnah said. So Rabbi Yeshua, Hoyo v'chutz l'mkoimo pasul, bal mum pasul. No, maybe you can look at it this way. Don't compare chutz l'mkoimoi to chutz l'zmanoi. Maybe we should compare chutz l'mkoimo to balmum. Balmum lo kiddush, av chutz l'mkoimo lo kiddush. So Rabbi Eliezer, ani demisin hu chutz l'zmanoi. I think it makes more sense to compare chutz l'mkoimo to chutz l'zmano, and just logically you would think right off the bat that makes more sense. V'yata demisul balmum. So Yomi daima. Let's figure out which one is more logical. Im daimel chutz l'zmano. If in fact you want to say somehow connecting chutz l'mkoimo to chutz l'zmano, then nidainu michutz l'zmano, and therefore it would be kiddush. Im daimel balmum nidainu balmum, as you said, and therefore it would not be kiddush. So Hiskel Rabbi Eliezer l'dain, he started to try to figure out which one is more logical to be compared to. So he says, danin psul machshava and psul machshava, and danin psul machshava and psul haguf. It makes more sense to compare chutz l'zman and chutz l'mkomo together because they're both connected to a psul based on your improper thought of it's going to be eaten outside the right place or right time. But a balmum is an issue on the body of the animal, so it's not the same. It makes more sense to compare chutz l'mkomo and chutz l'zmano together. Hisker b'shul then danim psul shein bo kares mepsul shein bo kares. Yachia chutz l'zmano shepsul sheyesh bo kares. We know zman is time, so you lose time, right? Zman is kares. So maybe we don't compare chutz l'mkoimo to chutz l'zmano because chutz l'zmano is much more strict. There's an iser kares if you eat it. But furthermore, nidainu mishlo shmo sheposel machshava ve'in bo kares. So we could even compare it to Shlol Shma. That's Pasal Machshav, there's no chorus. V'shasek Rabbi Eliezer. And at that point, Rabbi Eliezer was silenced. So he actually apparently agreed to him. Rameir, Maishna, Shachtam, and says Treifa. How come we're going to Rameir? If you shechted, it turns out to be a Treifa, which means it was always problematic. Davi Psula. Why is it a problem? Why is it not kiddush the lechem? Because tavi psul kaim shchita, right? Because it was already a problem. So ma'ishna shachtam nimsas balas mum. The law have psul kaim shchita, right? If it's a mum, so why is that different? So bedukin shiba'ayin v'lib Rabbi Kiva the emer im olu lo yardu. That our Mishnah is with the machlokas of a balmum specifically is by this case only, a bedukin shiba'ayin. Because since im olu yardu, so the din is different. But you're right. When it would come to a typical case of a balmum, maybe you're right, then the din would not be that way. Says Rashi, dahavi mum oiver. Interesting, it's a mum that doesn't last. Venu nicker, deloi havi psulo, koidem shchita. Interesting. Or it says on the side, el achar shchita. Okay. Ksaver Rabbi Akiva, Im olu yardu, v'hoyot lo yardu the kiddush koldahu. Since it has the ability to mekadosh a little bit, you don't put it up, but if you put it up, it does work. So therefore, lo chashiv sul kadem shchita hilka kiddush lechem. Therefore, we're going to say the bread is sanctified because bedukin sheba'ayin im olu yardu. So therefore, because of that, that's the reason why we'll say that the bread's going to be sanctified, according to that opinion. Rabbi Yeshua ki oimer Rabbi Kiva im olu yardu b'psul de gufa. Maybe that's only referring to the carbon itself, that you could break the carbon up there to keep it up there. Of a kedushi lechem lo itmar. He didn't say that, right? Well, this is having to do with, does it sanctify the bread? Why would that sanctify the bread? It's not the same thing. Okay. Chatas sheshachta chutz l'zmanai. So if let's say you shechted a carbon chatas and your machshava was chutz l'zmanai, so im also tered. If you put it up, you don't put it down. Chutzim kaimo. What if it's chutzim kaimai? So Rabbi Omer teir, Rabbi Omer lo teir. It's a machokas. So Rabbi could be Yeshua, Rabbi could be Lezer. V'hadim be Rabbi gabe the Rabbi, Mahadur be Rabbi Lezer gabe the Rabbi Yeshua. Some say Afal Gav the Hadar Be Rabbi Eliezer Gabe Rabbi Yeshua, just because Rabbi Eliezer retracted, Rabbi Gabe the Rabbi Loy Hadar Be, he didn't retract. Hasam Hudi Karmerle Nidaino Mishlo Shma. Avahacha I Dainisle Mishlo Shma im also loterid. Okay. Shachtel Shlo Shma B'chu. So my Papa Shavak Tadi Didan El Nazir Deshchiach. So our Mishnah mentions a case of El Nazir, which is common, but Nakit El Muluyim. He doesn't mention El Nazir. Instead, he talks about El Muluyim. The Muluyim is a once in a historic thing. So why on earth does he not give a more practical example, something that happens more often? So Vatani done Iker Milsa Nakat, which basically, as Rashi says, El Muluyim Sheboy Kichu Halechem Tchila. That was like the first time that it took place. That when it came to the El Muluyim, that it was Mekadesh the breads. And therefore that's the reason why he brought it down, not because it was necessarily the most common thing, but nonetheless the din was that that's what happened with the El Muluyim. So therefore we decide to bring that historical event down. Okay, let's look at question TA 28. Chatas sheshachta v'achshavas chutz l'zmano chutz l'mkaimo o shol ha'im tered. Okay, this is not an easy one, but we just did it, and I didn't do so well on this. So let's get this. Chatas sheshachta chutz l'zmanoi. So im also lo tered. So when it comes to chutz l'zmanoi, the time, we all say lo tered. Okay, that's clear. Chutz l'mkaimoi is a machlokas. Rabbi Omer tered, Rabbi Omer lo tered. Okay. And when it comes to Shalol Shema, right, we also say Shalol Shema im also lo tered. Okay, so that's the basic answer. So let's just write this down, then we'll flesh it out one more time. So Shalol Shema, Chatas Shalol Shema, or Chatas Chutz L'Zmanoi im also lo tered. However, when it comes to Chatas, which was Chutz L'Mkaimo, so there is a machlokas. Okay. TB1, Chatas sheshachta b'machshavas chutz l'zmano chutz l'mkaimo o shelo shma im tered. Same question. That's not a great way to start a test, but that's what it is. TB1. So let's see what I wrote. Chutz l'zmanoi sheshchiv chatas. What? Chutz l'zmanoi. So it is lo tered. V'gam shelo l'shma lo tered. Chutz l'mkaimo is machlokas. Okay, got that right. I'm going to cross this part out. Okay, so that's TB1. I got that pretty wrong. Im kiddush alechem. It says the bread going to be sanctified. This is actually our Mishnah. B'shachta chutz l'zmanoi, b'shachta chutz l'mkaimo, shachta shel shma, shachta v'nimsas ba'al zmon. Okay, so let's get this Mishnah. So when it comes to if it's shachted shlo, shachta chutz l'zmanoi, chutz l'mkaimo is kiddush alechem. Let's see if I wrote that. Shachta chutz l'mkaimo. This is very wrong. Okay. Ha'im kiddush alechem. This is by the Toida. Okay. So when it comes to the Toida, shachta chutz l'zmanoi or chutz l'mkaimo, shachta chutz l'zmanoi chutz l'mkaimo kiddush alechem. So shachta chutz l'mkaimo, the chutz l'zmanoi is kiddush alechem. Okay. The balmum, case of balmum, shachnas, balsmum is a machlokas. That is correct. Okay. Shelo l'shma. Let's find that. Shachtin Shalashma Lo Kiddush Halechem. Okay, so I got most of it correct. So I got a little bit confused between the carbon and the carbon chatos. Okay. All right, let's keep on moving. Let's see the next Mishnah. Hanasachim, when it comes to libations, here we're talking about, let's say, the wine libation, which accompanies the carbon, and it's put, so it is shekidshu b'kli, that it's sanctified into a kli, because you put it into a kli, and afterwards, let's say, after you did that, v'nimsa zevach pasul, you find out that the carbon was pasul. So what's the din? The carbon was pasul, so what's the din with this nesachim? So if let's say you have another carbon, and let's say there's no other nesachim except for this, so you can use these nesachim for that other carbon. V'im lav, let's say there's no other carbon, then absolutely yifsabelina, then you have to let the wine sit around for a night to its rasai, and then it's possibelina. Says the Gemara. So Armi Ziri. Ein hanasachim iskadshin el b'shchitas hazevach. So it seems unlike our Mishnah, which seems like it became kaddish was already only right when it's into the kli. So the din is known. The nasachim only are sanctified when the carbon is shechted, not in the kli. So my time. So recall the pasuk says zevach nasachim. So it sounds like they go hand in hand when it's actually shechted. And only when the zevach is brought, then the nesachim becomes sanctified. Tanan, hanasachim shekichu b'kli. Our Mishnah says that they're sanctified in the kli. V'nim says zevach pasul. Im yesh zevach acher. If there's another carbon, yaakov imo. Im lab yifsul belina. So ma'ila yifsul b'shchita. So the Gemara says lo the ifsul b'zrika. So what is this question? Says Rashi, the im kain. If it's at the time of the shchitas, when the nesachim becomes sanctified, ki nifsel hazevach b'shas shchita nifselu nami hanasachim, so it should pass on nesachim. V'amai im yesham zevach acher yakrivu imoi. So the kash is, why should you be able to bring, if let's say you have another carbon, why can you bring these nesachim? If in fact the carbon became sanctified, the carbon at the shashchit is sanctified in the nesachim, so then at that point, then the nesachim should become pasul as well. So even if you do have another carbon that shouldn't help, you shouldn't be able to bring. Here it says lo, the ifsul b'zrika. So what does that mean? The hoyel v'kvar kadshu nesachim shashchita, it became sanctified correctly at the time of shchita, and only later did it become pasul. So therefore, at the time the shechita was good, so therefore the nesachim take upon itself that it's not pasul, and therefore because of that, you can couple it together with a different carbon, if you can find it. Come on, Rabbi the Omer Shnei Devarim Hamatirin. If you have two things which are a matir, namely the shechita is a matir and the zrika is a matir. So malin zeh b'loy zeh. So there's it can be malin zeh b'loy zeh. Says Rashi, v'ani shchita v'zrika mekadshin hein hanasachim. The shchita alone could sanctify it. Kivan the ilu nesachim hukdeshu b'shchita. The nesachim already became sanctified. Afgav the ifsul zevach b'zrika. Even though the carbon later on at the time of zrika became pasul. Kitchu nesachim b'shchita. Nonetheless, it became sanctified. Mishum hachis, says Rashi. That's the reason why if there's another one, you could be makrabit with the nesachim. Fine. Good. So that's one answer. I feel to Lezer Reb Shimon. Hacham asking shekibel daman because what happened was you. Even though like Rabbi Lezer says Rashi, it made malin zebuloi zeh. He says the Omer lo kiddush alechem ad sheyishchot v'yizrok daman lishma, that the bread doesn't become sanctified, or the nesachim wouldn't become sanctified until the zrika. So therefore the kasha should pasul it. So he said what happened was shekibel daman b'kais. So you did the shchit and you were mekabel the dam b'nishbach, and the blood spilled. So you didn't end up really even doing the step of zrika because the blood spilled. As we continue on with base, Rabbi Lezer Reb Shimon Savar lo kavasedi avud yemer kol ha'omen lizra kazarik dami. it's like the zrika was done. So even though it's true when there's two matir and shchita and zvicha, shchita and zrika, that you need both, but over here, since it's spilled out, it's ke'ilu like it was done. It was kol oimid lizer kazar dami, and therefore because of that, the din is that the nesachim became sanctified. Omer Mar, how does that make sense? When it comes to oil, shefrishu l'shum mincha zeh. Let's say you designate oil for one carbon of a mincha, pasol shum mincha cheres. So this nesachim was designated for one carbon, so the carbon became pasol. So why can you use it for another one? It doesn't work that way apparently. So Rabbi Yanai will say that when we're dealing with a carbon seabor, lay based in masna lehen, im hutzruchu, that because we're dealing with the nesachim for a carbon seabor, so the beis din can make a condition and say the nesachim are for this carbon, but for whatever reason it's not needed, in this case because the carbon became puzzle, then it can be used for something else, as opposed to a mincha, in which we don't say lay based in his masna. So why not? Why can't they do that? Because shemen gufa de minchahu. It's very different because the oil actually goes inside the mincha. It's mixed in. It's blula, yitzika, right? It's part of the mincha offering. So you can't. Therefore, if something happened to that mincha offering, that's it because it's really all connected. However, the nesachim is, even though it does accompany a carbon, it's not the same thing. It's not connected and attached to it. And therefore, you can say lay based in his masna in this situation. So let the beis din say the neifku chulin, that this nesachim should just simply go to chulin. Right? Why do we have to say that if they're being masna? So why does it have to be masna that it should go to another carbon? And if not, there's no other carbon, then it's possibilina. Why don't you just make a condition that's just chulin completely if you don't need it? We don't want people to start thinking that we can, in all situations, put something into a klisharis and then all of a sudden use it for whatever purposes. Even though beis din technically could have made such a condition, but because people wouldn't know that it was specific to this type of situation, they would maybe apply it to other cases too. So Hashanam Gzera Shema Yermin Asachim Shafrishin Lushum Zevach Zeh Shem Lushum Zevach Acher. So why don't we make the same concern that people are going to say that people are going to have a nesachim and they're going to mafresh it to they can use it for another carbon, even if it was not masna. So our answers. So Hasni, Hatanim Matya ben Yehuda can go and show zevach zevuch ba'isa shah. We're talking about a situation where the carbon was shechted at that time. If not, my what? Nisobelina, that would be possible. To Adatani, Seifa, how come it says in the later case, Nisobelina, that if you don't have an extra carbon, then it becomes possible, and say like this, maybe the only time is if there's already a carbon there, shechted. Low. So hachinami kamer, that's actually what they're saying. That then the nesachim will work for it. It's considered like it should be possibilina. We pass it right away. So my answer is immediately Rav Shimon ben Eliezer lay based in Maslehen. Does he actually make such a condition? Does he actually hold that there's such a concept? But ha'omer Rav Idi b'Rav Rav Amram Rav Yitzchak Rav Yochanan to Midin. When it came to the carbon tamid, shul hutzruchu et sibor. So there was 4 taloyim that were left over on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and they wouldn't be able to use it anymore. So what do you do with them now, right? Because they would always have designated carbon these animals for the carbon tamid. Look at Rashi. Gagan oisa arba shahaya nisharim b'yom Rosh Chodesh Adar. Or maybe Nissan, Kishaya Neitlan Bays, they would take 2, Hayin Nisharim Dal, because they used to have 6. But Oisan Lo Hayasrichen, you don't need the other 4. Visha Oisan Haboim Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Boim Truma Chadasha. From Rosh Chodesh Nisan, you can't use old funds, it has to come from new funds. So those 4 leftover lambs on Rosh Chodesh, what did you do with them? You can't use them because you have to take from a truma chadasha. So it says Rashi, shul hutzruchu l'tzibor sha'avdu v'hifar shacherim tachteim v'yachachach nimsu. Let's say, for example, it got lost and then you found new ones, and then after you found the original ones, l'divrei Rabbi Shimon divrei Masechet Shavuos par b'sar shem v'kippurim sha'avdu v'hifar shacherim tachteim v'yachach nimsu, and you found them kilo yikru b'chag Sukkot yikru b'chag Hamatzos. They niftin tamidim. Why? The ain tanai based in shehisnu imlo hutzruchu yifdu. He doesn't hold of that type of condition. Now let's go back in the Gemara. Tamidim shul hutzruchu letzibur odi Rabbi Shimon ain niftin tamimim. Even though he said maybe you could be pointed as a tamim, he holds you cannot. So why does he say you can't? Because he doesn't hold a based in masta. So Mishani Hosim the Islay to Canterbury. So he says that it's different. He normally maybe he will hold lay based in Masta. But over here he says no need to say lay based in Masta, because why should you be pointed when it's a tamim? You can just let it graze until it develops a mum, and that would be enough. So that's Rashi, the sphere lay a nifnin, the ha isl hu takanta. There's something you can do. So therefore, if you have some other eitzah, so then we're not going to have you then we're not going to say you should be mafreshit pointed while it's a tamim, because lay based in masna. There's no need for lay based in masna. However, over here, when it comes to our Mishnah by the Nesachim, that if the carbon becomes puzzle, so there's no other choice. You can't. It's Nesachim. You can't let it graze. What does that mean? It's wine, right? It's not like an animal that's going to graze and develop a mum. So therefore, since there's no other eitzah, therefore maybe Hitaka does hold lay based in masna. Okay. All right, we're going to stop there. Maybe see another question. Nothing there. TA29, Hifresh Mais L'Toidaso, Lachmi Toida. Im Yochel Habi Behem, so this is Toidas a lot. Toidas, extra. Okay, we're not going to deal with that. That's going to be next Mishnah. TB2, Hifresh Mais L'Toidasai. Didn't do that. TC25. Madua benachasim shekit shebekli savar Shimon shekasher mozavo chachem yishul lebeis nemasna deal betamidim shel hutzol chatzibur savar she'eniftem tamim ve'inarmin lebeis nemasna. So beautiful question. Answer is very simple. Shani hasim deis le tekanta b'riya. I doubt I wrote that. That's TC25. Let's see what I wrote over here. Totally wrong. Okay, Adkan.